Hi everyone, I'm Shaylin here with Reedsy. Today we're going to be talking about dynamic versus static characters. Dynamic versus static characters are terms used to describe characters that change throughout a story versus characters that don't or remain static. Now sometimes static characters are equated to flat characters, which are underdeveloped characters that really only have one or two traits to them and not much depth. But this isn't actually the case. Static characters can be very well developed and serve a very important role in the story. So in today's video, we're going to be talking about the different roles that static versus dynamic characters will play in a story, and how using both static and dynamic characters can bring out the most of your protagonist. In most stories, the protagonist will be dynamic, meaning they undergo a change or arc. A well-developed, compelling protagonist who undergoes a journey is probably dynamic. After all, the journey they go through should likely change them, and they should need to change in order to go through that journey. If they don't change over the course of the journey, it might be a sign that there were never really any emotional stakes requiring them to grow or change. Or it might be a sign that it's not really a story, it's more of a situation without much of a sense of progression or movement. One of the most famous examples of a dynamic character would be Ebenezer Scrooge from A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. He's one of the most famous dynamic characters because the change he undergoes in a pretty short book is really dramatic. He begins as bitter and cold-hearted and aloof, really caring only about money. By the end of the night, after he interacts with the three ghosts of Christmas, he's redeemed and he becomes generous and warm and compassionate. It's a really dramatic arc that makes him a dynamic character. However, there can be really great static characters as protagonists. They're just rarer. One of the best and most famous examples would probably be Sherlock Holmes. He never really changes, but he's still very compelling. He remains witty, eccentric, and confident, his attitude never really changing no matter what conflict he faces. The thing is, the fun of these stories isn't actually watching Sherlock change, it's watching him use his brilliant intellect to solve mysteries in unexpected ways. He doesn't need to be a dynamic character for the purpose of these stories. He can be a static character and the stories are just as effective because they're not about his change. So while most stories do feature dynamic protagonists, there is a time and place for a static character to be in the lead. On the other hand, most side characters and antagonists are static. Not always, but often. This is because often they serve as foils, characters whose qualities contrast and therefore highlight the protagonists. Watson is a foil to Sherlock Holmes. He's modest, pragmatic, and selfless, whereas Holmes is confident, selfish, and brilliant. They're different, but their differences highlight each other's strengths. Now, what's rare about the Watson and Sherlock pairing is that both characters are static. Typically, we have static foil characters opposing dynamic protagonists, which highlights the way the protagonist changes throughout the story. Since antagonists oppose the protagonist, it's common for them to be foils and therefore be static. When the hero or the protagonist wins in the end, it's because they're able to change, whereas the villain wasn't. Again, this isn't always the case. You can certainly have dynamic side characters and dynamic antagonists. You can even have dynamic foils. This is just a very common setup. The reason the protagonist is usually the one who needs to change is because they're the center of the emotional stakes. They need to change in order for the story to reach its conclusion. Side characters can play a pivotal role in the story, but the story might not be requiring them to change, therefore they might be most effective as static characters. A great example here is Hannibal Lecter and Khaleesi Sterling from Silence of the Lambs. Hannibal is the antagonist, and he's also static here. He doesn't grow or change, but he is a foil to Clarice. He prompts and accentuates the change that she undergoes throughout the story, but she's the protagonist, so she's the one that needs to change in order for the story to unfold. It's not Hannibal's story in this case, so he can remain static. It doesn't make him less complex or less effective as a character. In fact, he's a fascinating character, but the story isn't requiring him to change, so in this case, he's static. Again, none of these dynamics are absolute. You can certainly have dynamic side characters or dynamic antagonists. This is just the most common setup that you see. Dynamic protagonist with either a side character or antagonist who is a static foil to them. The reason the protagonist is because they're the one that needs to change, and it's the story of their evolution. But other characters can still change alongside of them, especially if you're dealing with a very long story. When pairing a static character and a dynamic character, it gives both characters narrative purpose, and allows them to really accentuate each other's most compelling traits. The dynamic character creates and furthers the plot by pursuing something they need and needing to change in order to pursue it, whereas the static character can be a strong foil to really highlight that evolution. One of the other main reasons why we usually see dynamic protagonists is because a dynamic character is usually fueled by a goal that they are trying to pursue. And this desire is a force in their self-discovery and therefore their self-change. To succeed, they need to change in some kind of significant way. There's a motive behind them changing. There's something pushing them to change. And even if they fail in the end, they still will have learned something significant about themselves and undergone some kind of transformation. Most of the time with dynamic characters, what we see is a character who has a goal but also has a flaw that prevents them from achieving that goal, and they need to accept and overcome that flaw in order to get what they want. Meanwhile, a static character can really highlight that character's change because they're consistent, and so we have something to compare the evolving dynamic protagonist to. A classic example is The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald, where Gatsby's internal conflict puts him at odds with Tom Buchanan. Tom is a static character, but he's also everything Gatsby aspires to be. Despite being repeatedly bested by Tom, Gatsby continually fails to change in a way that might help him achieve his aspirations. But the fact that he's making efforts to change because there's something he wants makes him a dynamic character. And his character arc is highlighted in contrast to Tom's more static qualities. So The Great Gatsby is a great example of a dynamic protagonist who actually fails to achieve their goal, but it's the pursuit of that goal that forces them to change. So that's the difference between a static character and a dynamic character, and the role that both can play in a story. There's certainly a place for both types of characters, and most novels will have both types of characters. I've linked some blog posts and related videos we've done on this topic in the description, so you can learn more about character arcs and dynamic characters if this is a topic that interests you. Thank you so much for watching. Remember to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any new videos from us. We've got new writing, editing, and publishing tips every Tuesday and Friday. Until next time, bye!